The mysterious song of the desert that resonated mainly when it was getting dark. The famous English diplomat, scientist, and explorer Bertram Thomas, who in the year 1935 had just returned to his homeland from yet another adventurous tour of the vast and inhospitable deserts of Arabia, recounted that in many places he happened to encounter, quote, the wonder of sand that sings, and, quote, in that vast desolate expanse. The mysterious song of the desert resounded especially when it was getting dark, like a paradoxical complaint in the endless silence of the desert. At times one would say that some invisible hand was sweetly plucking the strings of a harp, but at other times he was loudly beaten with the membranes of a distant drum. The miracle of the singing desert did not only happen in Arabia. The sand dunes of California are famous for their song, especially near the Mexican border. In fact, the whole tradition has crystallized about their chant. The Mexicans used to say that a monastery was once buried under the sands of California, and that every day when its bells signals vespers, the sand began to murmur its song, which came from far away. But also in other parts of the earth, travelers and explorers had noticed that where the sand was piled up in bare mountains, it often emitted singing sounds and unspeakable melodies. Travelers from South Africa swore that they heard her laugh, while a Chaldean engineer in the late 19th century recounted hearing sandbars there that constantly let out a melodious whisper. In the Sahara, and indeed in the eastern parts, it seems that there are sandy areas that emit a sound that resembles a sad cry. And in the Libyan desert, travelers and explorers perceive the song of the sand, as also in Hawaii, where the sand bursts into a beautiful cry. When the natives of the island know that a fierce storm or even a typhoon will break out. Outside the U.S. state of Nevada, the incessant musical whisper of the desert can be heard more than 10 kilometers away. That's 6 miles away. It's supposed that the natural case of the voice of this desert is the grinding of thousands of millions of grains of sand against each other. Each time one grain slides over the other, it causes some pressure, and as this movement is repeated millions of times, sound waves are created, the vibrations of which cause those sounds that resemble singing. According to another theory, this phenomenon is explained by the fact that the grains of sand are mixed with grains of various salts, which, when the little water and humidity evaporate from a kind of membrane, they form a kind of a membrane completely impermeable to air. When therefore the grains of sand slide, they rub against each other above or below the membrane, and thus the sounds are produced, which sometimes resemble the melody of a harp or a violin, and sometimes resound like crying or laughter. Among the many traditions and countless tales that have formed around this paradoxical natural phenomenon, it's worth mentioning the superstition of the Tibetan people. The people of Tibet, therefore, used to tell their children that on the desert of the Tibetan plateau, that's around the Taklamakan desert, there lived a people of dwarfs. These dwarves were always cheerful and happy, and they were always organizing feasts and festivals, dancing to the sounds of a magical music. But when a prince of this tiny native and bird-like people happened to marry, then the magical flute of the desert became more beautiful and could be clearly heard by common mortals, that is, all the inhabitants of the Tibetan plateau. Even cuter is a story of the Maharaja of Kashmir. During the celebrations of his coronation, this rich lord wanted to amaze his guests, who had flocked from all parts of his exotic country. He had once traveled to America, and he had heard of the mysterious song of the California sands. He ordered, therefore, without reckoning at all the expense, that steamers should be brought to him to the Indies laden with this calcareous sand of California. Therefore, whole mountains of this California sand were piled up in the magnificent gardens of his palace. And the Maharaja and his guests waited with much anxiety to enjoy this otherworldly music. But unfortunately, to the great disappointment of all, especially the Maharaja, who had spent untold sums to have the sand sing in his palace, the sand became displeased and obstinate like a diva, it seems, and did not sing. Neither nature nor her wonders are bought, even by a pompous prince. However, many geologists have also discovered the existence of the singing sand in many parts of Europe. The phenomenon is observed mainly on the shores of the Baltic, where there are endless stretches of sand dunes which emit inexplicable sounds and murmurs. In fact, the English geologist Hugh Miller discovered such musical sand dunes on the island of Eigg, which belongs to the Hebrides island complex. That's the Hebrides are Scottish islands, as we know, across from Scotland. He had recounted how he was horrified one day when, while walking on the beach of this picturesque island, suddenly and without any apparent cause, a demonic and haunting noise began around him, a regular sound of invisible whistling. In the small town of Podogke in Czechoslovakia, this musical phenomenon was also noted there. There is a river in the area where the locals used to swim during the summer months, and everyone heard this strange chant, which sounded like a wailing, plaintive dirge. At first the song was heard from the opposite bank, and when the listeners went that way to see where the mysterious melody came from, it echoed again from the other bank, and then the same again. For a long time they could not explain the strange phenomenon, until geologists decided that without a doubt it was the same phenomenon observed in the deserts of Africa and Asia and California. However, the inhabitants of the area refused to compromise with such a strictly scientific and rationalized interpretation of such an impressive and melodious phenomenon. No, then, for them that sad song of the sand came from the souls of the slain soldiers who fell in the terrible battles near Mount White. Thus, as soon as night fell, they passed through their country and left as an unforgettable legacy their sad song. This was published in a Greek newspaper, The Nightly, Ivradini, on July 19, 1935, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.